Hi everyone. Welcome to the At Google Talks. I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the year, Ben Saunders. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's very exciting to be here at Google. I was having lunch just now. I can never turn down a free meal, so it'll come back to haunt me on day 58 of my next expedition. So I had a fantastic curry, and I was very aware of the incredible amount of brain power that is buzzing around this few floors of this building. So I should say as a sort of disclaimer, I drag sledges for a living, so I'm not going to dazzle you with any particular intellectual revelations. I should say also, the bad news is I'm standing here in front of a Windows laptop. I'm going to try and entertain you for the next, probably best part of the next hour or so, with PowerPoint. The good news is that my PowerPoint consists entirely of my holiday snaps from the last 6 years. On May the 11th, 2004, the year this photo was taken, I was standing on my own at the geographic North Pole. That's the very top of the world. If you spin a globe, it spins on the two geographic poles. All the lines of longitude converge there, so every direction was south. All the time zones converge there, so it could be any time I wanted. It's also slap bang in the middle of the sea. It's in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. So I was, I think the closest land was just over 1,000 kilometers away. I was the only human being in 5.4 million square miles. That's nearly 1.5 times the size of America. And I'd walked there alone from the north coast of Russia. In doing so, I became third in history to walk alone to the North Pole from any route. This is incidentally a very different North Pole. I don't know if any of you have seen Jeremy Clarkson driving to the North Pole on Top Gear. I'll explain that in a minute, but it was nowhere near the proper North Pole. Yeah, as I say, I mean, third person to have done this. No one's done it since me in 2004. So how come, in an age when more than 3,000 people have climbed Everest, more than 500 have been into space, how come only three of us have done this? Well, the first reason is it's a pretty daft thing to do. Everyone knows where the North Pole is. Clearly I'm not exploring in the Edwardian sense. I'm not skiing along drawing maps. That's all been done. Secondly, it's quite a difficult thing to do. As I said, it's in the middle of the sea. So to walk there, you've got to walk over the frozen sort of crust of ice that is floating on top of the sea, on top of the Arctic Ocean. You've all heard, it's getting warmer up there year on year. So this skin of pack ice is getting thinner with each year, and it's always moving around. It's never static. So it's an environment that is getting more and more challenging, and it's also in a constant state of flux. There are no maps because you're walking over the sea. It's all floating, it's moving. It's pretty chilly at times. Minus 48 degrees C was the lowest ambient air temperature I've experienced. A wind chill of nearly minus 70 on some days. And to top things off, I was spent 10 weeks, and this expedition took me 72 days alone in the natural habitat of the world's largest land-based carnivore, the polar bear. So the high Arctic doesn't have a lot to recommend it as a sort of gap year destination. And I'm going to preempt, hopefully, the three questions that you'll want to ask, and normally the three most common questions I get asked at this point. First one is why on earth would anyone want to do anything like that? What's the point? I'm not going to answer that right now, but I will come on to that towards the end. The second question is, Ben, I've read somewhere that at minus 40 degrees centigrade, exposed skin becomes frostbitten in less than a minute. So how do you go to the loo? Again, some of you are still eating lunch, so I'll skip this for now, but I will come back and answer it towards the end. I just want to sort of sow that seed in your minds. The third question is, what's next? How on earth do you top that? I'd broken 2 world records, age 26. A little bit worried I'd peaked a little too soon in my career. So how on earth do you top that? I will come on to that at the very end and give you a sneak preview of what I'm planning over the next 18 months or so. But I'm going to start my story back in 2001. This was my first polar expedition, very much my polar apprenticeship looking back. It was a 2-month expedition with a guy called Penn Haddo. We were Ben and Penn, the polar men, one radio station called us. Our plan was to walk, if I go over here, so this is sort of looking down at the top of the globe. So the North Pole's in the middle, geographic North Pole. Top Gear drove to the 1996 position of the magnetic North Pole, which is down here somewhere. So there's a bit of a difference. But the proper one's up here. And Penn and I planned, we set out to walk from the north coast of Russia, this group of islands called Severnaya Zemlya, from the northernmost tip to the North Pole. Simple as that. It's about 1,000 kilometres, 31 marathons back-to-back. No British team had ever done it. No one my age had ever done anything like this. But I thought I knew what we were letting ourselves in for. I'd spent the best part of 2 years trying to raise the money to do this. It's a particularly expensive way of going camping. Getting training, getting the experience I needed, studying maps and charts and logbooks and expedition reports and diaries and all this stuff. And we set out in February 2001. I realised very quickly that we were dropped by helicopter on the north coast of this island. This was taken by one of the guys in the helicopter. Realised instantly that I had no idea how much trouble I had landed myself in. Everything, it was so utterly extreme. I felt like a different planet. I'd never experienced temperatures like that. It was in the -40s, probably -45 when we were dropped. We're travelling on foot, so you can see we're wearing skis, each of us wearing a harness, and dragging a sledge that had everything we thought we'd need for about 8 weeks. It's our life support unit, basically. There's nothing out there, nothing living, the occasional bear, I suppose, the occasional seal and things, but certainly no shops, no people, nothing going on. So we're completely self-sufficient, dragging everything we need. Most of the weight of the sledge is food. Now, if you ever tried to carry a week's worth of shopping back to your front door, you can imagine what 2 months' worth of food feels like, weighs. We had, the next big chunk of weight was fuel for a cooker. We literally had petrol for a stove so that we can melt snow every morning, every evening to get our drinking water, so we can rehydrate the food and drink water, all that sort of stuff. We were obsessive about saving weight because the lighter the sledge was, the faster we'd go. So we'd cut the handles off our toothbrushes, we'd cut the labels out of our clothes, we'd cut the metal tags off zips and tied string through because it was a gram lighter per zip. We were absolutely nuts. We decided later in the day that we would just take one change of underwear each for 2 months. I thought I'd leave my toothpaste behind in Russia because I could share pens, that would save some weight. He did the same thing but didn't tell me. So we had no toothpaste for 8 weeks. We'd clean our teeth with snow in our little sort of sawn off toothbrush. It was pretty miserable. We were attacked by a polar bear on day 2. Clearly this is a reenactment. We'd just got, I was still completely in shock. It was my first morning waking up in a tent on the Arctic, camping on the sea, camping on the Arctic Ocean. So sometimes you can feel the ice moving, you hear it moving. Really quite frightening. Extremely cold at night. You're sleeping in a massive sleeping bag with all your gear on. And you have a face mask and a sort of hat, and you pull everything down and seal this sort of hood of the sleeping bag up. And when you're breathing at night, all your breath gets forced out of the top of the mask and condenses on your eyelashes and freezes. So I woke up to find that my eyes were actually frozen shut. My eyelashes were all sort of crusted up with ice, so I had to defrost my eyes. Anyway, we took the tent down, packed, if I rewind, packed the sledges, started moving. We were pulling about 117 kilos each at the start of this trip. I'm trying to think what that works out as in old money. It was about 17.5 stone each we were dragging, so quite a lot of weight. So you're moving quite slowly, it's pretty hard work. Penn was in front navigating, and I was following his tracks. And you're sort of leaning into this harness, and I was following his sort of tram lines in the snow. And you can't see much because you have this big jacket. There's a huge hood. There's fur around the hood, very high collar, often goggles and a face mask. So you have this tunnel vision with fur around it. And I was just head down following Penn's tracks. And I started getting a weird feeling that something wasn't quite right. And I couldn't put my finger on it. But it's the kind of feeling where you walk out of your front door and you think, I've forgotten something. If I got my phone and my wallet and my keys, something. It was that sort of feeling. Couldn't quite figure it out. And it got stronger. And I literally got sort of goosebumps on the back of my neck. And I stopped, put my ski poles in the snow, turned to look around. As I looked back behind us and looked up, I saw a bear, following us. So I turned around, screamed at Penn, who was carrying on. Luckily, he heard me. And our bear drill swang into action. Now, we'd practiced what to do once in the car park of a little chef. Halfway down the A303. This is absolutely true. The theory, top tip, the theory is this. Polar bears are right at the top of the food chain. They have no natural predators, so they're not really afraid of anything. Big creatures. The heaviest recorded bear was just over 1,000 kilos. I don't know who weighs bears for a living, but someone must do. They can move at between 25 and 30 miles per hour if they want to. Now, our top speed, pulling sledges, heavy sledges at the start of this expedition, this was GPS verified, was 1.5 miles per hour. So there's no way you can outrun the bear. So you have to stand your ground and try and convince the polar bear, largest land-based carnivore in the world, that you are bigger and scarier than it is. Penn was in charge of the gun. Now, we had a pretty dodgy shotgun that we bought on the black market in Russia. We couldn't take anything out with us, so we had to buy one in a town called Katanga. And we went with the shotguns. It's pretty simple. It works in the cold, and we were offered a sort of selection of ammunition. To save weight, we'd sawn off our shotgun, so we had this stumpy kind of bank job. I mean, that was Penn's department. Unbeknownst to me, he'd actually emptied the shot out of most of the cartridges, so we had blank bangers, basically, with a few that worked as a last resort. So that's Penn's job. My job was to look big. Apparently bears have quite dodgy eyesight. They see sort of silhouettes and outlines, contrast, but not much else. And they've got a very acute sense of smell. Now, we didn't wash for 2 months, so you can imagine that we were honking a bit by the stage. And I had to look big, so I take my skis off, hold the skis in a cross shape, and hoist them up in the air as the bear gets closer. And the theory is that sort of preempting the bear coming up on its hind legs. You're showing the bear a giant V sign, a sign of sort of aggression and defiance. So I did that, making lots of noise, shouting, kicking the sledge, lots of sort of 4-letter obscenities being screamed into the wind. And the bear just kept coming, walking towards us. And I could see Penn load the gun. You sort of open it and put the two cartridges in, close the barrels, and there are 2 triggers, sort of one behind the other, one for each barrel of the gun. And he held it up in the air. We're not on a safari. We're trying to scare it away first before pointing at him. And pulled the triggers, click, click. He said, the gun's jammed. two more cartridges, closed the barrels, pulled the triggers, click, click. He said, yep, the flipping gun still flipping jammed. Flip. 5th and 6th cartridge into the gun, closed the barrels, held it up in the air, pulled the first trigger, click, and everything went into slow motion. I remember feeling utterly calm, very, very surreal. I remember thinking, right, Penn is halfway through our ammunition. We've got 12 cartridges the last 8 weeks. This is the morning of day 2. And Penn's halfway through it already. He's throwing the elbows over his shoulder. Gun's not working. And then Penn took 2 or 3 paces sort of around his sledge towards the bear. And I remember thinking, crikey, Penn's lost it, obviously. He's going to get eaten. What the hell do I do? Penn's got the gun doesn't work. And I thought, well, okay, well, I've got 2 skis. Maybe I could sort of whack it with a ski. I've got 2 ski poles. They've got really sharp spikes on the end. Maybe I could sort of poke it with a ski pole. Have I got any food I could? And I couldn't quite think what I was going to do, but I felt quite calm, sort of ticking off my options. And the bear stopped, and Penn stopped. I thought, well, here we go. Bang! The gun went off in the air. Big cloud of smoke. I think surprised Penn and me more than surprised the bear. The bear sort of looked up, looked down, turned around, walked off. And Penn ran around and said, quick, get the camera, film it. And that's when the adrenaline suddenly kicked in. I couldn't even undo the zip on my sledge. As I said, that was the morning of day 2 of what turned out to be a 59-day expedition. Penn was quite relaxed about the entire encounter, so I thought, well, this is obviously what it's like. I had no reference points. I'd never tried to get to the North Pole before. It was pretty miserable. This was our tent. To save weight, it was custom-made. It was a single layer of fabric that stretched over 4 skis. You've got no tent poles. Ultra lightweight, ultra miserable. It was so lightweight that I could see the sort of gaps in the stitching, the sort of daylight in the seams. We couldn't afford a satellite phone that year. There's only one network that works over the poles called Iridium. We couldn't get hold of a SIM card. They'd just gone bust, and then they'd relaunched it anyway. So we were reduced to using radio, HF radio, high frequency, which is kind of World War I technology. The giant radio antenna we were given, we decided was far too heavy. So instead, we would poke 2 ski poles out of the roof of our tent. You can see one of the wires sort of dangling down. That was our radio antenna. It was so useless that we had less than half an hour's conversation, 2-way conversation with the outside world in 2 months. So we were enormously cut off. And there's not much going on up there. There's no, there's no media, no gossip, no current affairs, no nothing. We knew nothing of what was happening in the outside world for 2 months. There's nothing living really up there, the occasional bear, the occasional seal, but not much else going on. The scenery isn't changing much. So you start to go slightly mad, I think, and your thoughts turn inwards because there's nothing going on outside. We started, Pen and I, having the same conversations after about 3 or 4 weeks. We realised we just run out of new things to talk about. There was nothing happening in our world apart from, good day skiing today. What was the weather like? It was cold. So things weren't really changing much, and a very, very odd feeling. And the smallest things got blown out of all proportion. You're sort of sharing this. There's a huge paradox. You're in this enormous expanse of nothing, and yet you're living in this tiny, it's like a couple of your desks pushed together, tiny space. And the smallest things, the other person sort of farting or snoring or laughing in a weird way or cutting their toenails, we're all trying to eat and there's a bit of a toenail peeing around the head. The smallest things become huge friction points. It's a very high pressure relationship. Ultimately, we ran out of time on this first trip. There is a very definite time window, it's the spring really, in which one can walk relatively safely over the surface of the Arctic Ocean. And that time window is shrinking with each year, really, at the moment. It's getting warmer and warmer up there. In the winter, that far north, midwinter is dark, 24 hours a day, which really stops you doing anything. It's also very, very cold. Conversely, in the summer, midsummer's day, it's 24-hour daylight. The sun just does that. If you're standing at North Pole, the sun only sets and rises once a year. And it sort of does this spiral up. Midsummer's day, it does a little circle, and then starts coming down again in the winter. So it's a pretty disorientating place. So the spring is the only time window because it's getting light, so we have sort of 4 or 5 hours of daylight at the start. And you're really racing to get to the pole before it all gets too warm in the summer, and everything melts, and it's too dangerous. And we'd been given the deadline of the 1st of May. We were being picked up at the pole by helicopter, and the Russian pilots had said, look, if you're not there by the 1st of May, we will fly out along your route and pick you up. 1st of May came, we were just over 2/3 of the way there. We hadn't got there. We'd run out of time. And helicopter turned up, and I just remember feeling absolutely gutted. Looking back at this first trip, we had no music, we had no books, we didn't have any chocolate. It was a really ascetic sort of existence. We had nothing to look forward to, really. So I'd have these incredible daydreams, really vivid, like video clips that I would revisit day in, day out. And I had 2 that I'd sort of resort to really try and boost my motivation. The first one was reaching the North Pole itself, and I could see this being filmed out of the door of a helicopter. Blue sky, sun shining. I've got a big Union Jack tied to a ski pole. I've got sunglasses on. I'm looking good. There's a sort of Top Gun, soft rock style soundtrack. The helicopter kind of comes in. I've got this sort of flag flying at the pole. The second daydream was getting back to Heathrow Airport. And again, I could see the sort of electric doors opening and the arrivals thing. And I sort of push the sled through and I have a Union Jack over my shoulders or something, and there'd be microphones and flash bulbs and paparazzi and book agents and all this stuff. And neither of these things happened. We didn't get to the North Pole. We didn't even have a flag in the sledge. I don't know where that came from. And we certainly didn't have the budget that year to pay anyone to do the PR and the marketing. So no one heard about this trip. And I got back to Heathrow. I'd been out of the country for 3 months. I was utterly exhausted, completely depressed. And my mum was there. My brother was there. And my granddad, he did have a little flag actually, and that was it. And I entered what, looking back, was without doubt the lowest point of my entire life. I was physically a complete wreck. I was fired from the only sensible job I've ever had. My girlfriend dumped me. I had this huge beard, had sort of skin off my nose, I had a frostbitten toe. Went back to live with my mum. Spent weeks on the sofa watching Trisha Kilroy. My brother sent me a text message. It was a quote from The Simpsons. He said, "You tried your hardest and failed miserably. The lesson is never try." But I began to realise deep down that this was going to be a fairly pivotal moment in my life, and I had to decide whether I was going to try and get back out there and have another go at it, and that maybe it hadn't been a complete cock-up. Maybe I'd actually learnt some quite valuable lessons. And I had a lot of very hard-won experience on my belt, and I had to choose whether to go back and try again, do something bigger, or go into accountancy or something. I don't know. And I think, to my mum's horror, I started planning another expedition. This was my dream. This was back in 2002, 2003. I started planning this to go right across the top of the world, right across the Arctic Ocean. So from the same, this works. There we go. Same start point, north coast of Russia, to the North Pole, and then to carry on to the north coast of Canada. No one had ever done this on their own. Two Norwegians did it as a team back in 2000. It took them 105 days, I think. They ran out of food about a week before they reached the Canadian coastline. There was a doctor in the little ski plane that picked them up. He described them both as being 48 hours away from death. They'd pushed themselves to their absolute limits physiologically. I never told my mum that bit, but this is what I fancied having a go at, partly because a lot of people were saying it was impossible. Reinhold Messner, one of my heroes, an Italian mountaineer, he was the first to climb Everest solo, the first to climb Everest without oxygen. He tried this in 1997, a solo crossing of the Arctic Ocean. He was picked up after a week with an injured knee, and he described this idea of going right across to Canada on your own as being 10 times as dangerous as Everest. Now, I didn't tell my mum that bit either, but this was my dream. And I'd like to think that I hadn't lost my marbles completely. I knew that I wasn't going to succeed by being tougher than someone like Reinhold Messner or these two Norwegian Marines. So I had to innovate. I had to think differently. So this meant everything from cutting the front off my toothbrush as well, to big stuff like working with a fantastic team of scientists, very, very good sports nutritionists, in devising a completely radical approach to the food I'd be eating. That's me with 95 days of food, or most of 95 days of food. I fattened up. I put on 10 kilos. I'm 10 kilos heavier there, 22 pounds than I am now. And the journey started quite sensibly. We flew, I had quite a big support team flying out with me to the start point. We had a photographer and a couple of logistics people and a Russian translator and all these things. So big team. We had nearly a ton of excess baggage. We flew everything British Airways to Moscow. That was fine. From Moscow to Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Russia, we flew on a Russian internal airline. This sounded like Crash Air. From Krasnoyarsk up to the north coast of Siberia, a town called Katanga. No one really wants to fly there, so we chartered this pretty elderly Tupolev to take us up there. You'll note the lack of runway. We've stopped on a frozen lake here to refuel. These two guys are both smoking, as there's fuel coming from the front. The stray dog came with us for the rest of the flight. And the cameraman we had with us, it turned out, was a pretty nervous flyer at the best of times. And he asked the Russian pilot how long this next leg of the journey would take. And the Russian guy, in very good English, said 6 hours if we live. We did live. We landed in the dark in Katanga without realizing that it's actually dark most of the time there for most of the year. That's mid-February, taken around about midday. That's the light it was getting. That blob in the corner is the sun. It pops up sort of mid-morning, hovers around the horizon for it, and then disappears. The rest of the time, it's dark. You get this strange, dusky, orangey, purpley light. Apparently, 2,000 people live in this town. I have no idea what they do other than drink a lot of vodka. We were delayed there for a while, weather, not vodka, and finally flew further north by helicopter. We had two of these things flying in tandem, Mi-8, they're sort of ex-military things. You can hire them quite cheaply if you fancy a weekend getaway. And we flew in tandem. You can just see down here, this is the first one landing. It's not very good light, but that's the first one landing. You can see the snow blowing up in the wind. We landed just behind it. We've got two flying in tandem because there's no one up there. We were, by this stage, about 900 miles north of Katanga, so that was the last town. So really, it's the middle of nowhere. There's no Arctic Coast Guard or anything like that. There's no Arctic mountain rescue. There's no one up there. So if anything goes wrong, then you have to have your own contingency plan. So we had two helicopters. And looking out of the window, coming into land, it looked and felt like a different planet. It looks like Mars. I mean, it's utterly alien environment. And it feels completely hostile, very threatening as well. And we landed. We had about half an hour to unload all our kit, do a bit of filming and a bit of photography. You'll see some of the photos in a second that were taken next to the helicopter. And then suddenly the pilot did that. Everyone else climbed back in the helicopter. The rotors started turning. Wham! The door slid closed, and I was alone. That was the last photo that was taken of me out of the door of the helicopter. And I don't think words will ever quite do that moment justice. The only feeling I can remember is having to stop myself. I'm actually holding the front of my sledge as the helicopter takes off, having to stop myself running up to the helicopter, banging on the door and saying, look, guys, actually, I haven't thought this through. I suddenly felt really small, very, very scared, completely overwhelmed. I was an absolute idiot. I'd really landed myself in it this time. I'd been so busy. It had taken nearly 2 years to get this dream off the ground, this ridiculous project. where we're dealing with everything from Russian sort of people selling aviation fuel down to people that make thermal underwear and all the stuff in between. So much to organise and so much to juggle, and I hadn't actually taken a minute to step back and consider the enormity, perhaps the stupidity of what I was trying to attempt. And it hit me right then. I was going to be on my own for 3 months in arguably one of the harshest environments on Earth. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was 6 or 7. And I think this is a relatively low-budget way of getting the same kind of kicks. If you were parachuted into here in a pair of Speedos, you'd last a couple of minutes. It's such an extreme environment. Pulling 2 sledges at the very start, 95 days of food and fuel, still 1 pair of underwear for 3 months this time. The grand total was 180 kilos, 400 pounds, 28 stone, twice as much as I weighed at the start. And pulling that much is as tough as it sounds. It's really hard work. If I was showing off to a photographer, as I am here, I could just about do it. If the ice was flat, I could just about do it. If the ice wasn't flat, I didn't have a hope in hell. This is called a pressure ridge. These are by far the most common obstacles I'd come across every day. If you see, I'm trying to give an example. If you've ever seen Al Gore's film, Inconvenient Truth, there's this very, very good sort of computer model of the Arctic Ocean, and you always see a sort of globe with a big white cap at the top of it, the pack ice, the Arctic Ocean. When you get close to it, you realise it's not one big sheet of ice. It's lots of sheets of ice. And it almost looks like a pond with lots of giant white lily pads floating around, and it's always moving. These big sheets of ice are called pans. Some of them are miles across, but they're all, none of them are linked up. They're always moving. And when they bump into each other, whether that's through the currents of the ocean, the tides, if you're near the coastline, or the wind blowing them around, these 3 competing forces, they crumple up. It's like plate tectonics in fast forward. Often this is still happening as I'm trying to climb over them. Quite impressive, quite humbling when it is happening. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ice, lots of noise, sometimes sort of screeching and grinding and banging and popping, and very, very odd feeling. Sometimes you can feel it, the ice, you get sort of tremors through the ice. And some of these ridges would be 2 or 3 stories high, and I had to try and get these sledges over them. And I couldn't pull both at once. I had to pull one, leave it, and go back and get the other one. So I was doing 3 miles for every 1 mile north. So the average day on the ice, it's very rarely flat now. It's all pretty smashed up. NASA described the conditions that year as the worst since records began. We know for sure that the pack ice has got 40% thinner in the last 40 years, 1% a year. So I guess every year is really the worst year. But for me, the thinner the ice is, the tougher it is, because thin ice is more susceptible to being compressed. The really thick, old stuff is quite stable. Thin stuff gets smashed up. And it's always moving. I never woke up in the same place that I went to sleep the night before. And for 9 out of the 10 weeks I was out there alone, I was drifting backwards. Sometimes it was 100 meters overnight, that was fine. Other times a bit worse. The lowest point of the entire trip was about 2 weeks into it, and I got up in the morning, packed my sledge, skied north for about 8.5 hours, put my tent up in the evening, and looked at my GPS to check my position. And I was 2.5 nautical miles, about 5k, further south than when I started that morning. I still had over 1,000 miles to go, and I'd done minus 2.5 in a full day's work. So it wasn't the happiest evening in the tent that night. After another 2 or 3 weeks into the sort of end of March, beginning of April, the season starts to change. It's 24-hour daylight by now, and temperatures are rising. And I'd start to get reminders that I was standing on the sea, walking at the sea. The ice starts to break up. You no longer get these ridges, but actually the pans start pulling apart, and you get what are called leads. Leads are cracks in the ice. Sometimes they're just from the podium to that table I can jump across or span it with a ski. Other times, like this one, they're hundreds of meters across, like the Thames near here. I knew this was happening. I knew that water would be the biggest obstacle I'd face. So I had a secret weapon in my sledge. And it's called a dry suit. We took this photo the year before testing it out. Or an immersion suit. Basically, it's completely waterproof, goes on over all my gear, over my ski boots, over my mitts, seals around my face, means that if I need to, I can climb in and swim across leads that I can't find a way around. It's really last resort, but I swam 9 times that year, and without doubt, the most frightening thing I've ever done. Partly, and I kind of realised this a bit too late, but it's polar bears hunt around Leeds where seals pop up. So it's easy hunting ground. They'll patrol up and down. And I suddenly realised this suit was very orange in a very white area. I felt quite conspicuous. It took a good 3 or 4 minutes to put it on. It's got these enormous mittens. You can just see at the end of the sleeve. They're like oven gloves. There's no way I could use I had a rifle on top of the stage. No way I could use that with the dry suit on. So I saw a bear. I try and find the zip because you can't see it. So luckily never did, but it was always nerve-wracking. And then when you walk up to the edge and look in, it just looks black because there's not much daylight getting through the ice. So the water looks black. It's extremely deep. It's between 2 and 4 miles deep for most of my route. It's home to, as well as seals, things like killer whales, people think. I'm not sure quite how far north they go. Certainly Arctic shark. Sounds scary. They're blind, which is good. But they also track movement. They can sense movement in the water. So that's not so good. Giant squid, all sorts of things bubbling around. So it was pretty scary. I'd climb in, swim across, pull the sledge over after me, and carry on. I think if you told explorers of 40, 50 years ago that I was fully expecting to swim part of the way to the North Pole, they'd have thought I'd gone completely barking. But an interesting example of how people are adapting to a climate that's changing fast. Some bit of geeky stuff. I know there might be a few geeks in the room. There's a wonderful contrast between having HF radio, which is useless, and then finally getting my hands on an Iridium phone 3 years later. There's a wonderful quote. One of Shackleton's crew members, a guy called Thomas Ford Lees, back in 1914, when they got back, he said this: "The explorers of 2014, if there is anything left to explore, will no doubt carry pocket wireless telephones fitted with wireless telescopes." Now, I don't know what a wireless telescope looks like. Some of you may be working on just such a thing. But I had a little compact digital camera with an SD card. I'd take photos during the day. Every evening in the tent, I'd take the SD card out of my camera. I'd pop it into this PDA. It's an iPack. It's an ancient one. We bought it on eBay. We're on a budget. So it's a compact, compact iPack. Plug the photo in. We had some software to shrink it down because the bandwidth of the phone is tiny, tiny, tiny. So I'd shrink the photo down. I think the biggest thing, I sent a 200K video, and that took half an hour. So most photos were between 10 and 15K that I could realistically send back. And I'd write a blog entry. And the fun thing about this is it wasn't supposed to work. Iridium said it wouldn't work. HP Compaq said it wouldn't work. Motorola, who made the phone, said it'll only work with a Windows laptop. Anyway, we finally got it all working. And that was the website. This was back in 2004. Not many people had heard of blogs back then, so it had a remarkable amount of traffic. We had nearly 7 million unique visitors in the 6 months that the project was sort of live. We didn't have a huge media fanfare beforehand, so it just grew and grew and grew. And we had people all over the world. So I'd send back my sort of diary entry for the day, and there's information on the distance I've covered, my position, the temperature, all this sort of stuff. People would leave comments. We get hundreds every day. We had I think 400 one of the busiest days. I couldn't read these. I was just sending a little one-way sort of dial-up burst of data every evening. But incredible. And the potential of this only really hit me about 2 weeks into the trip. And I knew we had some schools following this. And I was skiing along one day, and I thought, hang on a minute, I'm dragging these massive sledges. I mean, all this weight behind me. Most of it's food, but I'm dragging a ton of fuel as well, so I can melt snow to get drinking water. Polar bears are mammals. I'm a mammal. Bears hunt out here the whole spring. They will go for months and months and months hunting on the ice. It's minus 40 or whatever it is that day. It's so cold that everything's frozen, apart from the occasional lead, but they'll freeze up pretty quickly, and it's seawater. You can't drink that. It's so cold that you can't put snow in your mouth. It will damage your mouth. Literally get frostbite. What do bears drink? What the hell do bears drink? And you get a song sort of stuck in your mind. You can't. It was like that. This did my head in for a whole day. I thought, well, I'm supposed to be the expert. I spent months up here, and I just suddenly realized I'd never thought of this. So I posted it as a question on my blog that evening, and I posed it as a kind of a competition. I said, there's a prize for the first school to answer it correctly. We'll send you a ski. I'll sign a ski and we'll send it off. And we had 480 something responses in that evening from schools all over the world. And I always forget to say the answer, which is that bears don't drink anything. They have an enzyme in their stomach that's unique to polar bears. They eat very fatty animals, seals mostly, and they can convert fat to break down fat into water. I never knew that. That was thanks to a school in Cincinnati. So I just suddenly thought, wow, I grew up being inspired by reading dusty old books about crusty old explorers, and here I'm able to get people actually engaging with what I'm doing in real time. They can ask me questions, I can ask them questions. How cool is that? It is not all high-tech, however. I think there is a misconception that it's easy nowadays. Every man and his dog's done it, been to the North Pole, haven't they? My grand's been on a cruise to Antarctica. How can it be difficult? I think people assume I've got an iPod, I'm watching DVDs in the tent or whatever, next series of Lost or it's not quite that simple, particularly when the weather's bad. If it's very, very cold, batteries, even lithium batteries, die really, really quickly. So electricity is a really precious resource. Things with LCD screens, GPS or my PDA, they go black when it's really cold. Everything goes really slow and sluggish. Things just fall apart. When it gets below about minus 35, things start behaving really strangely. Certain plastics and metals become very brittle. Things contract at different rates. And often when the weather's good and I can see the sun, I would mostly navigate using the position of the sun and the time of day. I'm not wearing my extra watch, but it's very old-fashioned, it's got no batteries in it, it winds itself. Which is how Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton and Nancy used to navigate. If the weather's bad and I can't see the sun, well, I could use a compass, but I'm way further north than the magnetic North Pole, so the needle points the wrong way. The fluid in the compass will freeze. Well, I could use GPS, but the batteries will die, the screen goes black. So I'd resort a lot of the time in whiteout, bad visibility, to using this ribbon tied to my ski pole that would show me the direction of the wind. That stays constant enough on the Arctic Ocean. It rarely you don't have big storms, I don't know why that is, but the weather stays fairly constant. And it's constant enough for me to navigate using the wind and maybe check with my GPS once every 2 or 3 hours or so, just quickly. So that's how the Inuit used to navigate. So there's a wonderful combination of cutting edge. We're looking at using photovoltaic fabrics now on the sledges to generate electricity, rechargeable kit, and yet at the same time these techniques that have been handed down through generations. Got to the North Pole on the 11th of May 2004. Took me nearly 10 weeks to get there from Russia. There is nothing there. There isn't even a pole at the North Pole. There is nothing there at all. There is nothing to distinguish it. It's like a bit of carpet in this room. There's nothing special about it. I knew that because it's sea ice. It's all drifting. Even if someone stuck a flag there and left it there, it would drift away. But I was still expecting something to be special, and there's nothing really. There's nothing there. So it's a huge anticlimax. I've just risked death and hardest thing I've ever done to get there, and there's nothing there. I've got a couple of bits of proof. This is a very blurry photo of my GPS. There's an N here. 9 string of zeros, 90 degrees north. I also have a thing called an Argos beacon in my sledge. Nothing to do with the catalogue. There's a satellite network called Argos, and that tracks my position. So I knew I was there. It was a pretty special feeling. I sat down on my sledge, pulled out my Iridium phone. I called my mum. I called my girlfriend at the time, and I called the chairman of the company that sponsored this trip. And I got 3 voicemails. I eventually got through to my mum about a quarter hour later. She was in the queue at the supermarket, and I could hear the beep of the shopping queue. She said to the girl at the checkout, it's my son, he's at the North Pole. Silence. She said, you'd better call me back, and then hung up. So it wasn't quite how I'd envisaged it, sort of grandest day of my life. Anyway, it was a special moment. I had a strange mixture of feelings as I stood there. On the one hand, I was pretty proud of myself. I'm number 3 to have got there ever. Worst conditions on the history, all this sort of stuff. So I was quite pleased. But on the other hand, it was alarmingly warm. You can see if I rewind, there were none of the sort of snot icicles and things there were early on. It was about -2, -3. Pretty tropical for the North Pole at that time of year. I've got thin gloves on, no face mask. It was very warm. Everything's starting to melt. I knew the chances of getting all the way to Canada were pretty slim. But I wanted to carry on for as far as I could. This was a week beyond the pole, on the Canadian side of the Arctic Ocean now. This was taken nearly 11 o'clock at night. It was quite late. Took this out the door of my tent. Some of the worst ice conditions I've ever seen, completely smashed up. And I just come off the phone to my team back in the UK. Team of one guy, mate of mine. He said, Ben, bad news, mate. Things are about to get a lot worse. I said, Tony, what do you mean? I've never seen ice this bad. He said, no, Ben, I'm talking about the weather. I've just been talking to the pilots and some weather forecasters. And you're in a big area of high pressure, clear sky, no clouds, great contrast, perfect flying weather. We're very worried that this low pressure is going to bring zero visibility. It's getting warmer. It's melting. The pilots are worried they can't land to pick you up. We think it's safest if the plane comes out to pick you up now before the weather gets a lot worse. Can you see anywhere for the plane to land? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the pilots want to use a ski plane. It's called a Twin Otter. It's got skis on it. They need a 500-meter runway of flat ice to land. I said, look, I can't see anything. I'm going to have a look. So I took my tent down, packed the sledge, started walked all through the night, all through the next day, finally found a bit of ice that I thought was big enough, looked huge. And I could measure it with my GPS, and I got to the end and looked at the screen, and to my horror, there's a big ridge at the end of it. It said 473 meters. I thought, there's got to be some kind of safety margin. I really want to go home. I'm had enough of this place. It's getting quite scary now. I'm not going to tell them it's a bit short. It'll be fine. So I phoned Tony back in. In fact, he'd flown out to Canada by this stage. He said, great, the pilots are ready to take off. They'll take about 9 hours to reach you. I'm a long way from anywhere. Just let me know if the weather changes. 9 hours later, on the dot, this tiny plane came buzzing over the horizon, flew in very low towards I'd left my tent up so they could see. It's bright red, they could see. They flew towards the runway, very low. They sort of skimmed over the runway, didn't touch down, but skimmed over it, straight towards this huge ridge, took off, turned around, disappeared, went silent. I thought, I've been rumbled. The runway's not long enough, they can't land. They've gone to look for somewhere else. There isn't anywhere else. I'm in big trouble. And then the plane came back, circled around different directions, very slow, same thing, skimmed over the runway, took off, disappeared. Great. They've been around both ways, can't land anywhere, haven't even had the decency to drop me a food parcel or anything. I'm completely shafted. I'm going to die out here alone. And I've been on my own for 10 weeks per stage. Probably wasn't being very rational, quite emotional. I mean, the plane, to cut a long story short, came around 5 times, finally landed on the 5th approach, skidded to a halt. You see this big ridge at the end of the runway, some of the lumps and bumps they had to avoid. It wasn't perfect. Taxied up to where I was standing, and I was suddenly quite worried because I knew that the pilot was called Troy. Now, I don't know if there are any Troys in the room, but I thought Troy was quite a tough-sounding name. And a Troy that flew planes in the Arctic for a living, these aren't, I think there's a kind of misconception that these are volunteers risking their life there. This is what he does for a living. He flies scientists around, and he spends all his life up here. But I thought he was going to be quite a hard man, and not impressed if I was crying, which I was. I was quite emotional. So I quickly, the engine stopped, the door opened. I thought, I've got to compose myself for Troy, And this guy jumped out. He was about that tall. He said, hi, my name's Troy. The co-pilot was a lady called Monica. They were the least macho people I've ever met. Troy lit this big cigar. He said, just get in the back. There was nowhere else to sit. I don't know if any of you had any sort of health and safety training as part of your, Google induction, but this is highly illegal, I've since found out. The plane was full of fuel. Troy climbed in the front with his cigar still glowing away. He's sat on the left, Monica's on the right. Pretty hairy takeoff. We just clipped this ridge at the end of the runway with one of the skis, and I could see straight into the cockpit. Troy is sort of battling the controls, and he took one hand off, reached back, flicked a switch on the roof of the cockpit, and it was the fasten seatbelt sign. Only in the air did I realise that there was actually a third crew member. He was called Rick. He was the in-flight engineer. He was asleep up the front, I think, when we took off. His job was, whenever there was it was just 9 hours back to Canada, long flight. Whenever there was a noise like that, he would climb up on all fours and sort of pull this pipe out and stick it in a different barrel. He was refueling the plane in midair. You can see Monica looking worried. She had a very fake-looking pair of Ray-Bans, and she'd left that sticker in the corner. I remember seeing that, just sort of. Anyway, they didn't really inspire much confidence. That's Rick. They brought me some orange juice. This flight cost $100,000. Next time you feel hard done by, when you get a little tray of food, this is my $100,000 flight. I had 3 cartons of orange juice for 9 hours. Monica's looking worried because if I zoom in, you see this fuel pouring, spraying around the ceiling. It was utterly hair-raising. I thought the Russians were bad, but this was something else entirely. But we clearly made it back. It was also a flight that left me with a pretty profound, lasting impression. This was the view just south of where I was picked up from. And when you're standing there at sea level, standing on the ice, you only ever see one obstacle at a time, whether it's a ridge or a lead, a bit of open water. Only from the air did I see the big picture. And I'm not a raving eco-warrior. I fly far too often. I'm not wearing any hemp. But it's pretty clear to me that things are changing, from my layman's point of view, that things are changing quite fast in the 7, 8 years now that I've known this place at first hand. Why that is, I've tried to avoid getting into argument, but it is certainly changing at a pretty apparent and obvious pace. Why? I'm going to start leaving this slide out because it's the hardest question. I still haven't got a one-liner. I've spent now more than 2% of my entire life living in a tent inside the Arctic Circle. Plenty of time to think of a nifty one-liner, and I haven't got one yet. I'm, as I said, clearly not an explorer in the Edwardian sense. Everyone knows where the North Pole is. So in some ways, I'm an athlete more than an explorer. I'm interested in challenge, I suppose. And I'm interested also in this word potential. I suppose on a personal, completely selfish, egotistical level, I'm interested in finding out what I'm capable of achieving. And I've wanted to pit myself against the biggest, silliest challenges I can think of. And I've kind of surprised myself, really. I don't think there's anything particularly unique about me. I'm not super fit. I'm not super brainy. I'm not super wealthy or talented or any of that. I'm not genetically somehow sort of freakishly adapted to the cold. I'm alarmingly normal. I've got flat feet. And the one thing I have been is probably unusually determined in pursuing this one slightly strange goal. And there have been many, many times, particularly in 2004 on this big trip, when I knew that I was going to give up. I had days when it was so tough that I'd fall over, I'd climb over some pressure ridge, the sledge would be sort of teetering at the top, and then it would come down, knock me over, I'd be flying, skis would be crossed up, I'd be tangled up on the ropes, and I'd sort of dust myself off, stand up, and genuinely, many, many times, felt disappointed, bitterly disappointed that I hadn't injured myself badly enough to call for a rescue flight with my pride intact. There were days when I wished that I could fracture my ankle or break my wrist or something that meant I could go home. And yet, whenever I got to that point, whenever I reached complete rock bottom, I always thought, well, I'm going to give up today. I can't do any more. I'm going to call for the plane. But before I do that, I'm not going to camp here. I'm going to go to that bit of ice there, and then I'll stick the tent up. I get there, and I think, well, it wasn't too bad. So I think, well, I'll go to that bit of ice. And that's how I get through another hour and another day, and that's how I did it, really. And so I don't think I'm unique in that respect at all. I think we've all got enormous innate potential as human beings. So on a wider scale, I wanted to, I suppose, get people thinking about their own daft goals, dreams, their own North Poles, their own potential. I read in one of Bill Bryson's books last year that the average lifetime is 650,000 hours. I thought that can't be right, so I looked on that sort of CIA World Facts thing. Actually, it's slightly more. It's nearly 700,000 hours now. It's not much. And I thought, well, how much do you spend just sleep? It was a couple of 100,000 hours. You had $450,000 in an account, and you could never pay in. You'd be pretty careful how you spent your money. And yet so many companies, so many people, so many organizations kind of go through their lifespan sort of waiting for the right time to do things differently. So I wanted to get people thinking about taking action, doing cool stuff now. Not waiting, just have a go, try. I do a lot of stuff with schools, with youth charities. I grew up in the countryside. I've benefited enormously from being outdoors from a very young age. I'm sad to say I don't think ever inspired by anything that happened in a classroom, which is why I'm dragging sledges for a living and not sat on that side of the audience. And I've realised now, living in London, my brother's a teacher at a big comprehensive. He teaches geography to teenagers who've never left that bit of London. They've never seen a hill or a valley. So that to me is where I'm going with all this stuff. There is method in my madness. How do you go to the loo? The short answer is as quickly as possible. How many have time? I'm not wearing a watch. Okay, I'll give you. Well, very, very quickly. It's quite interesting. The body goes into a form of shock in the extreme cold. It's called hypovolemic shock, and basically it tries to become dehydrated to draw circulation away from fingers and toes and anything else it feels are expendable. Now I'm quite fond of my sticky outy bits, so I'm drinking quite a lot during the day. I get through sort of 5 or 6 litres. The air is very dry as well, so you dehydrate very quickly. And the upshot is you need to pee the whole time, basically. So in the tent at night, it is way too cold to go for a wander and go for a pee. So I have a pee bottle inside my sleeping bag. On my first expedition with Penn, 2001, That's the only time I've ever spilt a full pee bottle. That's a pretty steep learning curve. During the day, you have to be pretty quick, especially if it's windy. The zips on my jacket and on my salopettes have big, long string toggles, so I can undo them with my mittens on. These enormous mittens. So I said, undo the zip, back to the wind, obviously. And I'd quickly take this enormous mitten, this big gauntlet off. And you have very thin fleece gloves underneath. If it's very windy or very cold or both, your fingers go numb really quickly. So often you can't feel what you're doing. Sometimes you can't see what you're doing. If you're wearing goggles and this big mask, there's ice all crusted up. So you sort of ram your hand in. Hope you've got hold of the right bit, because you can't feel anything. Start doing the business. Realise 10% of the time you're not holding anything. You're peeing down your leg. That's starting to freeze. And then zip everything up before it gets too cold again. Number 2 is quite civilized. I would use the porch of my tent last thing in the morning. Anything warmer than about minus 15, minus 10, especially if it's sunny, I go for a poo with a view. Now, the strange thing is this. I knew I was the only person in millions of square miles, and yet I was never happy doing it in the open. I always had to find a bit of ice to hide behind. English upbringing for you. What's next? Very quickly, because I'm running out of time. This guy is he's American. He's called Robert Peary. He's an admiral. This was taken exactly 100 years ago, 1909, spring of 1909. He is widely credited as being the first to reach the North Pole. People are still arguing fiercely over it now because, of course, this was a long time before GPS and all that malarkey. So he couldn't really prove he was there. And there is a debate because if he did get there, he did so in an astonishingly fast time, 37 days. That time has only ever been matched once in the 100 years since by a team also using dogs, and they had 7 airdrops of food and fuel and things en route to keep going. But on foot, no one's come close. And of course, Peary had to come back again, which everyone else gets flown out of the port nowadays. So an amazing achievement if he got there. And I thought it would be interesting to go and have a go at breaking his record. But I haven't got any dogs. I don't really use dogs. I just drag around the stage. So I thought I'll try and do it on foot. I had a go last year. These are sort of composite satellite images. This was taken when I started mid-March. It's Greenland up the top here, where we sort of top of Canada and Alaska, Bering Straits, Russia, around Scandinavia. And that's roughly the same angle. You see Greenland shifted slightly in mid-September. That's called the minimum sea ice extent. This figure is quite crucial for climate scientists because that's as far as it shrinks at the end of the summer before it starts to freeze again in the winter. And we've broken several records in the last few years when it comes to this minimum figure. The biggest change was between 2006 and 2007, mid-September, the same figures on both years. There was 1 million square kilometres less ice in 2007. That's twice the size of France, vanished in the space of 12 months. So it's changing pretty fast. So I thought that going fast was a good strategy. The time window is shrinking. And also, I thought it might be a world last. Everyone's sort of struggling to do these sort of firsts the whole time. This might be the last chance anyone gets. Dropped off last week of March last year. It's called a Twin Otter. Same plane as Troy used. We cheated. We took this a day before I started, but some pretty crazy ice conditions. This is one of the biggest pressure ridges I've ever seen. This was about a week into the expedition. This is vertical. I try and find a way over this thing somehow. That's about 3 stories high up to the top of that thing. Crazy conditions. And I broke a ski binding after 8 days. 2 screws and a little metal plate inside there. They probably cost about £1.50, these parts. And that was game over. The entire expedition ground to a halt. Without skis, I couldn't move through this deep snow between the ridges. Couldn't repair it. Didn't have the right spare parts. And that was an entire expedition, probably about $400,000 down the drain. And there's only one chance every year to go. So I'm hoping to go back in this spring, again towards the end of March. And then later on this year, planning to go to Antarctica. Now, it all hinges on money. And I was saying over lunch, I naively thought 7 years ago the hard part would be learning to survive at nearly minus 50 and navigating over sea ice that's moving. It was a piece of cake. It's the raising the money in between that's the hard part. So this all hinges on sponsorship. But the big plan is Antarctica. This has been bubbling away for a while now. Some of you might know the story of Captain Scott and Amundsen. But back in 1911, 1912, there was what turned out to be a race to be the first to reach the South Pole. No one had ever got there. And this is the kind of weird thing is this is sort of within living memory, and yet for a very few people. No one knew what was there. There were some scientists who thought there was another ocean. Some people thought there was a hole that went to the centre of the Earth, and no one could prove this. So Scott and Amundsen were trying to get there. The Brits, Captain Scott, had some dogs. They had some ponies. They thought would be good for pulling sledges. They had some tractors. Everything went wrong. Scott's last team of 5 ended up on foot. Amundsen had dogs. They started with 59 dogs. They finished with 11. They were shooting dogs en route and feeding them to the other dogs and eating dog meat themselves. Pretty brutal, but it worked very well. Amundsen got there first. Scott got there after just over 10 weeks to find a Norwegian flag. There was a tent with a letter for the Norwegian king saying, we got here first in case we don't make it back. And I would imagine pretty bitter and demoralised, Scott's team turned around and started walking back to the coast. They started down here at McMurdo Sound. South Pole's about there. It's 1,800 miles, nearly 70 marathons back-to-back, long, long way. Scott's team died on that return journey. They were caught in a storm. They were too weak to move. They were 11 miles away from their biggest depot of food and fuel. They were pretty close to pulling it off. And every subsequent South Pole expedition, there's a ton of stuff in the press. They've all been under this bar that Scott set. Most people now do some sort of partial bit of the distance. This South Pole race to the news, Ben Fogle, James Campbell, they're going, the pole is about there, and they're starting about there. So they're doing a bit of the distance, but they're doing about 300 miles. They're not doing the whole thing by any means. And Amundsen, nearly 100 years on, remains the only person, led the only team, to have gone both ways, from the coast to the South Pole and back in. No one's done it since. No one's done it on foot. A lot of people are saying that's impossible. No one's covered those kind of distances in these conditions. So I thought that would be an interesting challenge, and I've been working away at this for a few years now. We've figured it out. So hopefully at the end of this year, late November, we'll set out from McMurdo Sound, same start point as Scott, and the plan is very simple, to walk there and walk back. It'll be the first return journey to the South Pole on foot, longest unsupported polar journey in history. It'll take about 4 months. We'll be blogging every single day. That's my website, bensaunders.com. I want to leave you with one final thought, and I'll have to answer questions if you don't have to rush off. I have a school report above my desk at home, framed, age 13, and there's one line that I like. It says, Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile. If I've learned, in some ways they're right, of course, but in other ways, I think one of the really big lessons I've learned through doing what I've been doing for the last 7 years is that no one else is the authority on your potential. You're the only person who decides how far you go and what you're capable of achieving. The right people around you, the right tools, the right technology, anything is possible. That's my story. Thank you.